Weight gain is huge, Mike, for people. All of a sudden, like in this house, 50-pound weight gain, haven't changed a thing, even decreased their consumption of calories and increased exercise. That's a mold exposure. Now, there's other reasons too, but this sudden, no other reason weight gain, because that leptin adiponectin is affected. And what will happen is this insulin resistance, and the patients basically cannot burn fat.
Wow.
So it's crazy because they can even do like a ketogenic high-fat diet and they cannot take that and use it to burn. So it's so dysfunctional that even the typical diet interventions we would do are not helpful to them.
Hey folks, it's Mike Muscle here with HighIntensityHealth.com. Thanks so much for tuning in to episode number 114. And today we're live with Dr. Jill Carnahan again. She was on episode number 33. So if you want to check out that episode, learn a little bit more about her practice and so forth. She's in the Boulder, Colorado area. And Dr. Jill and I met, I think it was 2008 or 2009, we actually sat together on one of the first advanced practice modules for the Institute for Functional Medicine in LA. And so we've been kind of, following a similar trajectory and path here with education and various friends. And so I'm just super excited to have you on again, Jill, to talk about mold. How are you today?
Thank you, Mike. I'm excited to be here.
Fabulous. So both you and I have personal experiences as of late with mold exposure, and we are both a little frustrated and kind of ran around the circle. But I would love to hear you share. You're moving offices, I believe, and you ran into a mold issue. So let's kick it off with that story.
Sure. So, boy, where to start? I guess the key is about 2013, there was a flood in Boulder, Colorado. And you would think that would be one of the most dry areas, one of the best areas to live if you have, issues with mold or whatever else. First of all, I had no idea that I would be genetically the mutant that had extreme sensitivity to mold. And there's about 1% of the population, and we can talk later about this, with the dreaded genotype. And guess who has that genotype? So through this experience, I found that out and found that I was a canary that was very, very susceptible to this exposure. But what happened was, prior to that, I battled cancer and Crohn's and survived, and thriving from all those illnesses, was probably in the best shape of my life. I ran the Boulder and, record time and that kind of thing a couple years ago. And so 2013 was a great year. 2014 was a good year up until this summer. And as is often the case with mold or water damaged buildings, is you have the episode of the water leaking in and soaking some porous materials. And then you have, sometimes the winter, it's not too bad initially. And then the sun comes out and kind of bakes that and starts to have the growth and the thriving of those fungi. And then that's when I first started having symptoms, this last summer. And for me, the first symptoms were I had new onset asthma. Never in my life, in my 30-some years, have I ever had asthma issues. And I had brand new, pretty severe, significant enough that, number one, I couldn't run anymore. And number two, going up the 2 flights of stairs in my office, we have a 2-story office, I would literally be short of breath just walking upstairs. I was so embarrassed because I'm like, what do my patients think? I'm so out of shape. And but I knew there was something weird going on. So this new onset asthma, and then the other piece was my immune system was going crazy, as far as I would have new viruses and get sick really often, and fungal skin infections and all kinds of bizarre things that I knew I was like something, as a functional medicine root cause person, I thought, something's wrong with my immune system. And I actually, at that time, it was July of 2014, saw an expert immunologist to help me. And he diagnosed me with a combined variable immune deficiency. So literally a severe type of immune deficiency. And again, I said, this is really weird. What is going on? What can do lung function destruction and immune destruction? And the funny thing is, Mike, I knew intuitively mold is probably the number one cause of those two types of things in combination. I ignored it for a while because I didn't want to deal with the ramifications.
Oh my gosh.
One thing I want to be sure we talk about for your listeners, if they're worried about exposure or whatever, this is a scary thing because it can mean changing jobs, moving houses, leaving everything you own. I mean, this is as bad as a fire or tornado or some of those kinds of dramatic things in some people's lives. So I knew intuitively that this was either home or work, somewhere where I spend a lot of time. So over a few months' time, I continued to go downhill, and I said, okay, I have to figure this out. Did some of this lab testing we'll talk about today, and found a marker that's notorious with mold. And again, intuitively I knew, and I kind of ignored it, but a few weeks later I went ahead and did a urinary test that shows if my body had accumulated these mycotoxins. It was off the charts for a very toxic mycotoxin called trichocythine. So then I knew. So then it was just a matter of testing home and work, and I found in my basement of my office where there had been some water damage, there was this growth of Stachybotrys, the notorious toxic black mold. And the funny thing was, and this will be just like your listeners' experience, you can have a whole family. I had my whole office. Everybody else was fine. So this is very selective on the people it affects. I was getting very ill, and if I would have stayed, I'm sure I wouldn't be able to practice and continue. I mean, I'm doing great since I've got out. But when I found that out, I had to leave. The night I found out, I literally didn't go back into the office and left everything, sold everything, all my books since medical school, Mike, I had to get rid of. And that was the hardest thing.
Oh my gosh.
But anyway, getting out, and that's the first step for, as we talk about this, you have to get out of the situation or you'll never get well. And thank goodness I found it pretty quickly. I got out, and it's 9 months later, 6 months, 6.5. Anyway, I'm doing a lot better, maybe 80-90% recovered.
Wow, that's amazing. Thanks for going into that detail. And I would love to hear, just if we could dive in a little bit deeper. So you started to, you were, competing athletically at a high level, the boulders, I think it's a 10K, right? So it's pretty competitive at altitude.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden you started to notice these symptoms. So for our listeners that have had health, challenges, I think we all have at some level. It's part of the human condition, at least for myself, I've noticed that we kind of ignore things like, oh, I'm just going to eat better and exercise more. But as your health deteriorates and you finally go in and, like you said, your intuition kind of leads you to where you thought in the beginning. So how long were these symptoms going on before you said, okay, I got to go in?
I didn't get the mycotoxin test and the positive result till November. So that's June, July, August, September, October. That's almost 6 months. That's bad.
Yeah. Wow. So what do you think it is that, I'm just trying to unravel the mindset here that goes on. What do you think it was that caused you? I mean, you obviously are very educated. You're a physician. You're advanced, trained in functional medicine. Why do you think you ignored it? Did you think it was just something that was transient? I mean, talk about that maybe if you would.
Oh, yeah. And I think this is actually huge because we can talk about the biochemistry and everything, but underneath all that, there's real people with real symptoms, and we talk to them every day. And the reality of it is it would involve dramatic change and loss. And I think I knew that on it. First of all, I don't like change. I don't know who does, but I like my routines. I like, knowing what's ahead. I usually have a 5 or 10 or 20-year plan. So the thought of either, and we had just in January, Mike bought a brand new condo. We love the place. We just designed it all. So I was in a brand new place I loved for my home. And then this work, I had an incredible office staff, environment, a partner. Everything about this was in a great situation. I loved my practice, and I had actually designed my clinic, my room I saw patients in, and it was another bamboo flooring and really modern facility, and it was just gorgeous. It was calming. It was in my home, my sanctuary. And then I knew about the porous materials, so whether it be clothes or books or things that can't be cleaned well, I knew that I could potentially have to give up a lot of stuff. And so stupid, because stuff doesn't matter when it comes to the reality of our lives. As far as our happiness, stuff does not make us happy, but I love books. I was going to be a librarian before I decided to go into medicine. So I love books, and it was really, really hard to know that I could potentially have to give up all that stuff. But as soon as I realized my health, nothing can replace your health. And so, and even as patients find out this, they realize pretty soon that it's worth giving up everything to have good health. And I came to that conclusion. And when I did, it was immediate. And, I acted and made the changes. So
yeah. Good for you. And I remember watching that, having lived in Boulder for 9 years. It was devastating seeing that floods. I think it was in August or September. So I would imagine that and we have a lot of listeners from Colorado. I have a lot of friends there. There's a lot of folks that probably have toxic homes and or workplaces. So are you seeing this now that you're more in tune and aware of this? Are you seeing a lot more cases of mold toxicity?
Mike, it is amazing. And I've tried to look into, so why is this? Why is this in, 2015 so much more of an epidemic? I think there's a couple things. First of all, yes, flood, and that can occur in any climate. So Arizona, New Mexico, these places where we think they're safe for mold. And some of those, like Arizona, where the fluctuations of heat are so high and the air conditioners are running, the condensation of water, any part in your building is a potential for mold. So if these, 120 degrees outside in Arizona in the summer, and there's condensation with the air conditioner, there, that can be a total nidus for mold in these dry climates. And then of course flooding. And I can't tell you the number of people where I will hear their symptoms, and let's definitely talk through those so people can kind of recognize symptoms. But they'll tell me a list of symptoms, and I've seen these patterns enough that I'm like, oh, there may be mold. And I'll ask questions. And I'll ask, have you ever had a flood or water damage in your house? Have you ever seen visible mold? Does it smell musty? Do you feel funny when it's rainy outside or really wet or damp? Do you feel more tired or more sinus congestion or fatigue? Or brain fog is a huge, huge component. And as these patients tell me that, oh yeah, we had a little flood in our basement. We dried it out with a fan. Or we had a major flood. And I had a patient of mine, I'm still working with her. She said, okay, well, we bought this, my boyfriend bought a house in near Boulder. And the person before us had actually stuck the water line from the fridge into the wall and not capped it off.
Oh
I know. It was like that for 9 months before we realized there was this huge leak in the wall. We saw mushrooms growing out from under the wall. And I said, you think there might be a mold problem? And then the thing is, even if people know that there might be an issue, they have no concept of the devastation, if you genetically are that canary, how it can totally destroy your health. So people, even they're like, oh yeah, there's a little bit of black slime in the kitchen wall. Yeah. I'm like, oh my goodness, do you realize that could be your problem? Yeah.
That is devastating. Well, it's scary stuff. And we're definitely going to get into the symptoms and testing. So I don't want people to be like, oh my gosh, we're just sharing stories. But I have a quick story I want to share.
I want to hear it. Yes.
So I sold my condo in Boulder in April, and it had some mold underneath. And so we wanted to get it tested to see, okay, first of all, is it toxic mold? What is it? Is it just fungus, mold, and so forth? And figuring out someone that could test it, it was really hard. You just Google, like mold testing Boulder, and there's all these different companies. Some of them are just, one-off, gentlemen who aren't certified, and then they're certified groups, and then they also do the remediation along with the testing. So you don't really know, okay, are they giving me accurate information, or do they just want to redo, the whole, water vapor and get the fan and all this sort of stuff? So I found that to be very challenging. So that was my kind of first exposure. And then we recently moved and bought a home in Kirkland. And as I was moving in my office, I moved my desk, and I have two big, nice bookcases, which are since I've gotten rid of. The whole wall was loaded with black mold. And I had this breathing issue for a very long time where if people listen, or I've been listening to the podcast for a while, you can hear me go like in the early, because I lost my breath, and I thought it was a cardiac issue, even though I'm in shape. Like I was lost. I had all this fatigue and all these, various things going on. And so I also have this soundproofing equipment. If I kind of move my camera around, you can see this is all new. But when I pulled the soundproofing from my old place, it was just loaded with mold. So I was spending like 8 to 10 hours a day in this room. They would have mold everywhere. I had breathing issues, fatigue.
Yeah.
Just like, sleep loss. And I just thought, man, I'm getting older, or I'm overtrained, or I didn't know what was going on. And here it was mold, and it was just all hidden, like you said, where it can be behind a wall in a kitchen. So it's a really big deal. And since moving, breathing issues, fatigue, I haven't done any specific therapies to help detoxify the mold or modulate my immune system. I just wanted to see what, my body could do naturally, and then hopefully maybe learn a few tips from you and talk to Keith later down the road. But so I think it's a really big deal that we're all susceptible to, and we don't know the history of our work environment, of our home. It's a really big deal. So for people, I would say just make sure you check your home, move your furniture around. I wasn't aware that you could have an issue in Arizona and Texas and things like that. People are going to be really surprised by that. So let's get into the nuts and bolts now. How did you test your genotype?
Yeah, so there's a test that you can get through LabCorp or Quest. It's called HLA-DR Typing. And so you do that, and there is a Rosetta Stone by Dr. Shoemaker. So you actually have to learn how to interpret this. It comes back with these numbers that don't really make sense, and you put them in order, and they do make sense. And there's really two that are super, they're called the dreaded genotype. It's 11-3-53 and 4-3-52. Those are the names of those genes. And I happen to have one of them. So of course, now this is actually for me as a physician, I'll tell you what, anyone I suspect, I will do that, because if they have no susceptibility, it's highly unlikely that they're going to get a systemic immune inflammatory response from the mold. So I can almost rule out some of these things if they don't have that. But I'll tell you what, the people I'm suspicious of and have all the symptoms, so far, 100% of them have a risky genotype. So I'm usually pretty good about, and most physicians could be, as far as learning what to look for. So usually usually when I suspect something and there really is a mold issue, the people who are getting sick really do have these genotypes. And it's, I think Shoemaker did some research on statistics. He said 1% of the population has these two dreaded. So it's pretty rare. But when people have that, they can get extremely sick and have a lot of trouble getting well.
So that other 99% of the population, I mean, it's knowing what we know about bugs and bacteria and yeast and parasites, they're really immune to the mold biotoxins, or they're just not as symptomatic? I mean, is there kind of a gradient here, or is it black and white?
It's not black and white, Mike, of course, right? And it's interesting because those are the ones that get sickest quickest and stay sickest the longest. So those are the ones that have harder. The really bottom line is HLAs are basically, I think of them as a little Pac Man in the immune system to check antigens to say, and this could be with food too, because HLA typing, and get this, the celiac HLAs are related to the mold HLAs. I have celiac disease. So guess what? That relates to the susceptibility. It basically is misprocessing of antigens. And that's why people often, when I see them with this chronic inflammatory response syndrome that Dr. Shoemaker describes, they have had either Lyme, they have had Epstein-Barr virus, they have had some infection that kind of triggers this wrong antigen presentation. So what happens is the immune system should be able to react to infections and toxins and things and take care of them. But when we have dysfunctional HLA Pac Man that sample our things that are out there in our environment, when they misprocess those, they can overreact to something that's non-toxic, or in the case of mold, they overreact to something toxic, but the body cannot get rid of this toxin easily in someone like me. So someone like me has to actively do things to get rid of this toxin through binders and all kinds of agents like that will actually help the body to get rid of it. And in addition, this all has to do with antigen presentation, because when that's dysfunctional, that's one of the underlying inflammatory things with someone with Lyme disease. It's not always just the bug that's causing the problem. That could have been the trigger and start of that inflammatory pathway, but you've seen people 10 or 20 or 30 years down the road, and they may not even have evidence of that Lyme, but they're still very sick. And that's because this dysfunctional immune system has started this inflammatory cycle, and it's a vicious, vicious cycle that triggers and triggers. And what happens too is the people who are susceptible to Lyme, which you can test on that same HLA type, are often very susceptible to mold. So that's called the multi-susceptible. And then there's also certain ones that are just susceptible to Lyme or other infections, and other ones that are just susceptible to mold. And then there's others that are susceptible to chronic fatigue and viruses. And so there's actually multiple types of susceptibility through that HLA testing.
Wow, this sounds very important for people to, I think everyone should probably know this. So this HLA testing,
yes,
it's part of the antigen sensing system and so forth. What lab does this?
Yeah, I use LabCorp or Quest. I usually use LabCorp primarily. They do a little bit better job of the way it comes back as a report, but any major lab can do that.
And they'll look at all the different subtypes, or do you have to kind of give them, because there's a DQ4, DQ8. Can you kind of dive into the details on that?
Yeah, so if you're testing for the celiac genetics, there's a DQB1, and that piece is used in the HLA-DR typing to determine those numbers I was telling you. So if you're ordering, usually for any new patient, what I'll order is a celiac HLA typing. And that's the name of the test that checks for DQ2 or DQ8 if you have 1 or 2 copies of each. And just as a little digression, because it is related, people who have either 2 copies of DQ2 or 2 copies of DQ8 or 2 copies of one and 1 copy of the other are very, very high risk of problems with gluten processing. So they may or may not ever get celiac disease, but that gluten could be a trigger in this inflammation of the immune system and create autoimmunity. And it's interesting, we'll talk about this too, but autoimmunity and mold go hand in hand. So part of this inflammatory process creates this dysfunctional immune system that can't react to environmental infections. So you have this dysfunctional immune system as far as fighting infection, but then you're overreactive as far as the self-antigens in your thyroid or your brain or lupus or joint connective tissue disorders. So many, many people will start to, after mold exposure, present with autoantibodies, rheumatological disease, and autoimmunity, and that's part of this whole mess. So bottom line for HLA celiac, HLA-DR typing is for celiac, and then HLA-DR by itself is for mold, Lyme, all of those other biotoxin illnesses, and both can be ordered through LabCorp.
Great. Yeah, that's fantastic. So that's available pretty much every
yes.
state in America, probably globally. And I think that's really important because a lot of physicians and a lot of people would do like tissue transglutaminase. I had a family friend who their child had a lot of like GI issues, and they said, "Oh, we went to the doctor. They don't have, this little boy doesn't have celiac disease because
Yes.
transglutaminase." And it was with a bunch of people, so I didn't want to like get into it, and I'll talk to them later about it. But really important stuff. I think we should all get tested for. Now, my second question, we had Alana Cullen, the author of 10% Human, on the show, and so we talked about these traits that are genetically, heritable, wouldn't still be in the genome if they didn't have some sort of benefit. So have you ever hypothesized or maybe read about some of the beneficial properties to having, like you call them, the canary genes, that 1%?
Yeah.
Is there any benefit, or is it just all not good?
You're right. There's got to be some benefit. And I suspect this is an overreactive immune system. So it's someone who sends the alarm out very quickly and early, where it maybe shouldn't be happening, but it's also this protective mechanism that's on red alert. So I suppose as far as protecting, it might be that, and I don't know, I'm just hypothesizing, but it might be that in the case of a virus or something else, your body is quicker to react. I do see, Mike, some of these really sick people say, I haven't had the flu for 5 years, or I haven't had a cold for 5 years. So there's this thing, the interesting thing is they maybe have some sort of a virus and their immune system is so dysfunctional, they aren't symptomatic. I've seen that before, where they actually might be getting sick. And part of why we get sick, this cytokine storm, which starts in mold illness, Lyme, any of these infectious illness, is what makes us feel headache, fever, flu-like, tired. We have to lay down with a headache. Those symptoms are actually from cytokines in our own immune system. So often the first response symptoms are because of our immune system reaction to an external, potential threat. And it's not just that threat causing the illness. And so people who don't have that reaction would be more likely to have these HLA types, and they may say, oh, I never get sick. And in reality, their immune system is not doing that thing it's supposed to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's like a point of bragging, like, oh, I haven't gotten sick in like 10 years. But in reality, what you're saying is that just means that their immune system is not producing the appropriate cytokines to respond to the potential trigger, which is not necessarily a good thing.
Right.
Yeah, great information. Okay, so let's go back to your story. So you did this testing, you figured out that you were susceptible, you cleaned up the office, got out of that office, and then what are we doing to your body to modulate the immune system and get rid of the mold? What can we do?
Yes. So if you don't mind, I want to go back real quick. I mentioned a couple symptoms, but I think it's so important for patients to know, like, what might you present with mold?
Perfect.
And I had some of these, not all of them, but a lot of them. Fatigue is huge. So now fatigue can be huge amount of things. It's not just a mold illness, but brain fog and memory. So I'm usually pretty quick on words and finding in that. And I noticed I would have trouble getting a word or remembering a word. So these weird, especially word finding, tends to be common with mold illness. It does affect the brain. And if you do a NeuroQuant from Dr. Shoemaker's testing, or you do a SPECT MRI or a functional MRI, you can actually see the changes in the brain from the mold. So it's crazy. It's very, very real. And you can see as people get recovered, that goes away. So word finding, memory issues, very common. And just feeling like fog. So this like brain fog where you can't really focus or concentrate or complete a task easily. I definitely had those symptoms at different times. And then red eye, so just the classical allergy. Mold by nature tends to make you a histamine-producing factory. So it's interesting. I know you've talked about histamine. I wrote about histamine. So histamine intolerance, that can be a presentation sign of mold issues. So allergies, asthma, it's like the mast cells go crazy and they throw out this histamine and they're super reactive. So our mast cells are supposed to produce histamine when there's a trigger or allergen, but it's supposed to be pretty selective. So maybe we have just a ragweed allergy in a certain season and we trigger that histamine response. Patients who've been exposed to mold always have histamine issues. So their mast cells are super reactive. When I first went through detox and was getting exposed, I literally would have hives from my neck down, like complete and total body hives, severe as I've ever had. And I've never had anything like that in the past. So this was all new. And the asthma, the allergies, all of that were increased. Red eyes, I didn't even know. Again, I kind of ignored it, but I would have red eyes every day at the end of work. And I'd have these allergy eye drops that I kept in my desk drawer probably 20 times a day. I'd be dripping in my eyes so I didn't look like I was, hung over or something. But that red eyes, the allergies, that's my skin. So skin often, if I look at patients and they're, 45 years old and they have new onset acne, the skin is a detox organ. So the skin will often be new onset acne, sores, lesions, scalp issues. So you can have psoriasis or fungal issues in the scalp and skin. The concentration, joint pain, very, very common because of this inflammatory response. Numbness, tingling, shortness of breath, sinus congestion, the red eyes, the blurry vision, and static shocks. So this is fascinating. This is kind of unique to mold. And this is because mold will affect the pituitary axis extremely. And we can talk about all of that if you'd like to. But one of the hormones in the posterior pituitary is antidiuretic hormone. And that controls our saltwater balance. So I would notice, personally, I would get very, very thirsty. I could drink all day long and I'd urinate all day long, but I would never stay hydrated. I felt dry skin, dry eyes, very thirsty, and I couldn't stay hydrated even if I drank, 12 bottles of water in the day. And this is because that antidiuretic hormone is affected when MSH, which is another hormone that regulates the hypothalamic axis. In mold illness, it almost always drops. And that will regulate cortisol, adrenals, thyroid, antidiuretic hormone. And antidiuretic hormone, because it drops, it isn't able to respond to a dehydrated state. So what happens is basically patients like myself, when I had this, was you're dehydrated all the time. And so you have a lot of salt in your vascular system and not a lot of water, free water, because it goes right through you. That salt will actually precipitate on your skin. And if you were to test skin chloride, you would actually have a higher salt content than someone who had cystic fibrosis, which is crazy. That salt then creates a battery. So when you touch a light switch, you touch your spouse, or you have static shocks. So any of your listeners out there that have bizarre static shocks, they might want to check for mold. I actually had a patient, Mike, this is crazy. He came in and one of his main things was saying, I would literally break electronics. My watches, I've been through 10 watches. Every one of them within a few weeks will break. My cell phone, my computer, I've broken so many things at the office. He was a professional. And I said, this is bizarre. This is so bizarre. And he actually had a Gauss meter where he did some sort of a testing on himself. It was like hundreds of thousands of times more potential that his body was producing. And I looked and looked and looked, and this was before my own experience. And I finally said, you know what? There's got to be mold. This is so bizarre. Well, guess what? His whole attic was full of mold.
Oh, that is so.
So this weird static shock. If you're breaking electronics and your watches quit working, check for mold.
Oh my gosh, that is frightening, because a traditional physician would never, they would probably just assume the patient was maybe crazy.
Exactly.
We don't have that in our ICD-9 book.
Right.
Wow. Thanks for breaking that down. Now, I've heard Ritchie Shoemaker speak. I think he spoke at the 2011 International Symposium here in Seattle, Washington. And at the time, he had said that these patients need to have at least, I think it was between 12 and 24. So they can't, and I would love to hear your approach, because in functional medicine, we kind of look at all these, antecedents and triggers. So do you have to have all these things, or is there do you have to have 3 of the symptoms? Because you mentioned a lot of symptoms, and a lot of people do have at least 1 or 2 of those, types of symptoms. But when should someone dive deeper? Is there a threshold there at some point?
Yeah, great question. And I do have a list of all the symptoms on my website, on the blog, if anyone wants to actually look at those and say, do they have those? But bottom line is, I feel like all of these things can, like I have a view with Lyme and mold, and then which is more important. And what I love about Ritchie's work is he is a science guy. He's done incredible research, and he's given us some of these statistics and some of the immune dysfunction. He's been the detective. So he's the leader in this by far, and I have great respect for him. The way I'm a little different is I come from the functional medicine background, looking at root cause and kind of looking at how do we support the whole immune system, look for triggers for sure, and treat those, but also, nutrition, basic diet. And I tend to try natural things before drugs. So if needed, there's some appropriate drug treatments, but I definitely like to use things that are a little bit more natural if possible, and if they're working. And I found some of those to be very effective. So symptom-wise, you really, to have sickness from this, you have to have a known exposure. So, and on the corollary of that is the very first thing you have to do is get rid of the exposure. You cannot do any sort of binders or treatment or anything until you get out of the place that's making you ill. And then someone like me or anyone who's been exposed to mold is going to be really susceptible. I now, Mike, can go into places in Boulder and be like, within 15 minutes, this place has mold, we have to get out. Like, I'm a canary now that can actually test. I have a friend who was selling their house and they didn't want to test for it. They said, can you come over and just tell me if there's mold? But I know immediately with my symptoms, and it's really crazy. And actually, as I get well and more well, the healthier I am, I'm actually more and more sensitive, which is a blessing and a curse, because I can avoid buildings now when I know they're a problem. But I also, I have the curse that I have to be very, very careful, because there are some places in Boulder that I can't go.
Yeah, like good popular restaurants, perhaps, or?
Yeah, it's funny, like courthouses and schools and older buildings are the worst. So the sad thing is, as I look at statistics, schools are alarmingly high, courthouses are alarmingly high. So some of these beautiful old historic buildings are really, really problematic. And I would say I've treated multiple school teachers for this. Schools are epidemic in their problems, and it's so sad. They just don't have money to remediate. They have water leakage everywhere, and so that's really a problem. And you think about our kids, you know, obviously learning is affected by this, so it's really sad to see how many schools are affected.
Sure. Now, what advice, we have a lot of parents that listen in, what advice would you have? Homeschool or do a Montessori school, test the school? What do
Yeah.
you,
You know, it's really tough because most of the time the principals kind of have their hands tied. I really believe they always have the best interest, but their lack of funding or, you know, inability, and these can be huge, just like we talked about, the loss people can experience as patients. If it's a huge thing in your house, it could mean, you know, tearing out a huge part of your wall. It could mean moving, if it's irreparable. And in the school, sometimes the damage is so bad that it would mean tearing down the building and rebuilding. So obviously that's not an option. If someone really suspects their child, children can have the same testing that I would do for a chronic inflammatory response for an adult, the same labs. And those will also show in children. And if there's evidence from their physician that there really is an issue, they need to get out. And I guess if the school isn't responsive, they would have to homeschool. I have had a couple of high school students where I've written notes, they need to stay out of these certain classrooms, which it sounds crazy, but as long as they avoid some of those places where they know to be an issue, they do okay. So that might be a thing too.
Perfect. Great tips there. Okay, so let's talk about biomarkers, and then we'll get into some of the treatments. So we talked about the HLA antigens and so forth, genetic testing.
Yeah.
I know C4A is a big one, MSH,
Yeah.
HOMC, leptin. There's like
Yeah.
a whole myriad of these different things. How important are those to you, and which ones are kind of you looking at?
At the beginning, it was funny because like, oh, we don't need to do all these, you know, I'll just try, you know, C4A or the HLA typing. I'll tell you what though, Mike, I have found them to be incredibly helpful. And it just, again, reiterates to me how Dr. Shoemaker has paved the way with this, with his research, because they are right on. And when I suspect an illness, I see these patterns and I'm almost like, oh, wow, this is so cool, because, and I get excited. And the patients are, in a way, they're excited too, because for so many years they've gone to docs. And if you check a CRP, inflammatory marker, right, that's going to be normal in these patients. If you check ESR, another inflammatory marker, normal. If you check a CMP, which is a basic metabolic kidney, liver, normal. CBC, most of the time normal. So all of these like routine labs will be totally normal in these patients, and their doctor will be like, yeah, you need to see a psychiatrist. And it makes me so sad because many of these patients have been relegated to the fringe because they've, you know, been thought to have psychiatric illness. And, you know, I didn't mention another symptom, but rage or anger. Thank goodness I didn't have any of that myself, but anger, rage, bizarre depression, like really dark. I've seen this, like someone gets back in a building within 24 hours, they have the deepest, darkest, they're like happy-go-lucky, and all of a sudden they're suicidal. So this can very quickly change the brain and the mood as well. But back to biomarkers. So typically I will test, and I'm doing this by memory, so hopefully I'll remember them all, but we'll do the HLA typing for sure. I'll do leptin and adiponectin, because another part of the system that this affects is it creates this insulin resistance where insulin cannot get into the cells due to dysregulation of cortisol. And often it'll affect the pancreas, because as the toxins are binding to the bile acids, innocent bystander, the pancreas will be affected, and these people will have elevated lipase or amylase. So then they can sometimes have exocrine dysfunction, which is poor pancreatic secretion of enzymes, but also poor insulin production, and even present, there's many, many cases of these people going on to be diabetic when they have, you know, no family history or anything like that. So the leptin adiponectin will show early signs of insulin dysregulation. Weight gain is huge, Mike, for people. All of a sudden, like in this house, 50-pound weight gain, haven't changed a thing, even decreased their consumption of calories and increased exercise. That's a mold exposure. Now, there's other reasons too, but this sudden, you know, no other reason weight gain, because that leptin adiponectin is affected. And what will happen is this insulin resistance, and the patients basically cannot burn fat.
Wow.
So it's crazy, because they can even do like a ketogenic high-fat diet, and they cannot take that and use it to burn. So it's so dysfunctional that even the typical diet interventions we would do are not helpful to them. So we have HLA, leptin adiponectin. We'll check VEGF. VEGF is a marker that basically shows capillary tissue perfusion. So this is something I absolutely saw. Mine was elevated. It hasn't gone down, which is a good sign. Usually early in the illness it will go up, because it causes new blood vessel growth. So what it will do is allow the capillaries to feed the tissues better, because your body, because of that toxin, is getting signals that you can't deliver to the tissues. For me personally, how this presented was, I was, like I told you, I was a runner. I used to run, 10Ks multiple times a week. And all of a sudden my legs would go numb, like a quarter mile in. I could not perfuse. And it's like, what in the world? I could tell, because I knew the physiology. I was like, my tissues are not perfusing, and the lactic acid is building up. It'd burn, it'd get heavy. And sometimes I would literally, from my knees down, go totally numb. Wow. So, and that was, in hindsight, that was this VEGF that was creating poor capillary perfusion. I still am recovering from that. And what that will do, that VEGF, the EGF, will cause TGF-beta to rise. So TGF-beta is this master puppeteer in the immune system that regulates autoimmunity, Treg cells and T17 cells. And what it'll do is it'll totally suppress Treg cells. It'll decrease poor antigen presentation. It'll affect MSH, which affects cortisol, leptin, ADH, all these other things. So this is an incredibly dysfunctional disease. So then you see this rise in TGF-beta, and that can be measured, and you'll see, again, most of the time people are pretty high. I've seen 13,000, 20,000. I think the highest was in the 40s, 40,000. I mean, incredibly high TGF-beta. And again, that will lead to autoimmunity because there's no Treg cells to kind of keep it under control. And this whole thing is perpetuated because that TGF-beta goes around to VEGF and lowers VEGF even further. So these people come in with poor capillary perfusion, very, very poor exercise tolerance, like I experienced. That's common. And it gets worse because this vicious cycle feeds that. And unless they pull out of that, get out of the exposure, it's so bad that they can barely walk, and they'll feel that lactic acidosis and all of that as well. So you have TGF-beta high, you have VEGF high initially, and then that will usually drop over time. And if you catch it early, like in my case, fortunately, at least at this point, my VEGF has always been high, never dropped. And that can actually be a protective mechanism. Then you can check MSH, which we talked about. Now, MSH is kind of late in the illness. And what I've seen with that is people who have had some exposure a long time or have had this illness a long time, they often will have less than 35 is abnormal. And they will often have very, very low MSH. And it is just, that's again another master in the endocrine system and in the pituitary and hypothalamus. So that will affect ADH, like we said, saltwater balance and hydration. And that will also affect the perfusion and the TGF-beta. That will affect the cytokine storm. There's like no regulation of the cytokines. And that will affect cortisol. And what happens is cortisol has no feedback loop to ACTH, so both can be either high or low, and they don't feed off each other. So it's incredibly dysregulated. So people can early in the disease present with really, really low cortisol, like adrenal dysfunction, but there's no regulation, and giving them cortisol may make it worse. So that same axis, the MSH, also affects female and male hormones. And what you see very commonly is this incredible upregulation of aromatase. So what that does is basically, for men, they're low testosterone because they're taking all that testosterone and making estrogen. So man boobs and weight gain around the waist and all that kind of stuff will happen. And docs who don't know what's going on will give them testosterone. Well, guess what, Mike? That will just push into that estrogen pathway, make them worse. So no cortisol, no testosterone, unless you really know what you're dealing with these patients. So in women too, we'll actually have that aromatization, and they'll go down to harmful estrogens. What they'll have is they'll have incredibly painful, heavy bleeding, fibrocystic breast, endometrial fibroids. They will have endometriosis. They'll have 3-week or 2.5-week periods, so dysregulation of the cycle. So again, you have this dysfunction of saltwater balance. You have dysfunction of testosterone and estrogen and upregulation of aromatase. And then you also have dysregulation of cortisol and adrenal function. So basically the whole endocrine. And then we didn't even talk about thyroid. Thyroid is totally, yeah. And what'll happen again, TSH will be normal. T4 might be, free T4 might be a little low, but normally that's okay too. But they'll be profoundly symptomatic for hypothyroid. Because basically this toxin will prevent the receptors from recognizing the thyroid hormone. And once again, if you give really high dose thyroid, that can actually make some of this worse. So when they're in this vicious cycle, it's tricky because just like the typical anti-aging approach to slap on hormones can make these people pretty sick.
Gosh, and you describe like basically a lot of very sick Americans, right? The low testosterone in men, visceral adipose tissue and so forth, the overweight, 73+% of Americans are either overweight or obese, insulin resistance with all the leptin and all that. So this is all these like light bulbs were going off as you were talking. This is like a big aha moment for me, and I'm sure many of our listeners. So Now that you know this, Dr. Jill, and you've been looking at the gut, I mean, doing some advanced work for quite some time on the leading edge, I think this is really out in front of what, standard of care, even a lot of functional medicine practitioners. In your estimation, with all these sick people and sick people, like you said, like they go on hormones and it backfires, they they're symptomatic for thyroid, but when they get on thyroid, it's off. Do you think this problem is a lot worse than we currently recognize and the prevalence is higher?
Absolutely. I'll tell you what, I've been a functional medicine for 14 years and I've done a ton of hormone replacement and functional endocrinology in the gut and all of that. But a friend of another functional colleague and I were talking, and people are getting sicker and sicker. And because I've really specialized, now I see the sickest of the sick. So the acuity and the types of thickness of charts that I see now they've been everywhere. They've tried everything. So I definitely have a skewed perspective, and I'm seeing a ton of this. But I also think that in general, we have such a total toxic burden in our environment with chemicals, exposures, unclean air, all of these things, that this is a lot more prevalent. One thing I wanted to mention earlier that I think is so fascinating, and I read that in the 70s in the paint, basically they started putting anti-fungicides in the paint because they said, okay, we want to prevent mold growth. Well, what that did, just like our antibiotic uses selectively, selecting for resistant organisms, it started selecting for the most toxic producers of these mycotoxins. Because a big question a lot of people ask is, why did we not have this bad of illness, 20, 30, 50 years ago? And we didn't. It's way, way worse nowadays. Well, nowadays, the types of molds that we get in houses, first of all, they're much more sealed off because of environmental, procedures that keep that airflow inside the building. That's actually a really bad thing. So some of these brand new buildings that are pristine and have no external, internal airflow are the most sick buildings. And they have these the molds that are growing produce these way, way more toxic. Klinghardt did some research, Mike. This fascinates me. And it was basically the electromagnetic radiation and its effect on mycotoxin production. So what he did is he had a shielded little mold dish, and he measured, so shielded from Wi-Fi and all these things, and that dish didn't really produce a whole lot. But then he threw just a regular router, like we'd have probably right next to me for our Wi-Fi, it was by the mold dish, 600 times the amount of mycotoxin production. So you think all of us living now, especially cities, but I live in a condo and every single person has their own Wi-Fi router. So I'm surrounded by this radiation, or not radiation, but Wi-Fi, electromagnetic radiation. And for someone really susceptible, even think about this, if I have mycotoxins inside my body, and those molds feel threatened and are producing mycotoxins, I don't have evidence of this, but it makes me think that someone in an environment where there's a lot of, not nature, but lots of environmental electromagnetic radiation exposure, they could actually become sicker because their bodies are producing more toxins in that environment because the mold feels threatened. Crazy, isn't it?
That's frightening stuff. Yeah. And I know he talks about heavy metals in the context of, I think it was Candida and other pathogens. So I wonder how metals and toxins also affect the mold. But that is so fascinating because, like you said, everyone has a Wi-Fi on it. And a lot of people don't know just to simply unplug their Wi-Fi when they're not using it or when they go to bed and things of that sort. So I know there's a paint that has like an EMF shield type thing. So in your own condo, since you brought it up, are you doing anything to mitigate some of the EMF exposure?
Yeah, fortunately, I have not found that to be a huge issue, but I do some basic things. So I do earthing, which sounds kind of hippie. It's just walking barefoot, and I go to the Boulder Creek, throw my feet in the creek about once or twice a week, and walking barefoot on the ground when I can. There's a real power to that, and there's a whole book written and lots of great stuff. Sinatra, I think, Dr. Sinatra has his son was healed with some of that exposure from a difficult illness. So that's simple. And that grounding, basically you get your body connected to the electrons of the earth, and it's powerful, and it makes sense because we have electricity. I mean, we check our EKGs, that's a measure of electricity. Otherwise, I try to make sure that I'm not in a triangle like my cell phone, my router, and my computer. I make sure they're in front of me or behind me. I will show you real quick, something called a HeraPad that has totally saved my lap with the laptop. It's kind of dirty, so you have to excuse it, but it's just a black protector of electromagnetic radiation. So you can take your laptop, take it to the coffee shop or anywhere you go. I used to see patients have my laptop on my lap, and I would actually feel the radiation in my legs by the end of the day. So I got that. It's HARAPAD. I have no affiliation, but it's a wonderful device. You can buy things for your phone. I never, ever, ever put this up to my head, ever. I use the earbuds, or I use the speaker. And that's just because you've seen the studies on glucose metabolism of the brain and that radiation, and it's all inches. So 5 inches is like, thousands of times less exposure than 1 inch.
Right.
And so that's a pretty easy thing to do. I do not have a handset in the office or at home. It's not so much for the cell phone, but the cordless. Thank you. I don't even know what they're called anymore because you don't have the cordless phone. Yeah, the cordless phone, relics, get rid of it. That's actually worse than your cell phone. So we got rid of our cordless. I have tried turning off the whole circuit at night so there's no electricity. Again, I like convenience, and it's kind of a pain. Depending on when my husband and I go to bed. That would be great for someone really sensitive. Just turn off your circuit breaker at night, and then in the morning turn it back on. That's simple. You can get all kinds of fancy meters to measure dirty electricity. Clean Heart has a bunch of types of things you can plug in to decrease dirty electricity in your outlets. I haven't done a lot of that, but I think there's validity. And my patient, like I told you, that was breaking watches and things, I think for him it might be super important.
For sure. That's great information. We had Evan Brand on, and he's done a lot of research into the EMF. So if you guys are interested in kind of diving into that, go into highintensityhealth.com, just type in Evan, and that will pull that up. So Dr. Jill, this has been so informative. This is one of my favorite shows. We're at episode number 114, and this was like a ton of information and breakthrough. And I know we still need to kind of talk about treatment, but we're getting short on your time. I know you have to go back to practice. So what sort of tips would you offer, and maybe what are you doing personally to enhance your body's immune response and sort of detoxify some of these, mold toxins?
Yeah. So first thing you need to do is and I have to say this again, you have to get out of the situations. You have to find out where that exposure is coming from, and you have to get out. And you can remediate in some cases, but people like me that are super sensitive, what happens is those dead molds can be just as toxic or more toxic than the live molds. So if you just throw bleach on an area, that actually could make things worse for someone like me. The reason for that is that disintegrates the mold, the little spore, and then all those little mold particles go around. And what I'm sensitive to is not just the spores, which you can do air testing and get spores, but the mycotoxins you can't test in the air, and they put off these VOCs when they're threatened. So volatile organic solvents are almost impossible to check in those mold environmental testing kits and things like that. So get out of the situation first. Get a professional remediator second. And third would be get an air filter. So I have a beautiful air filter at home and work, best investment I ever made. And again, no affiliation, but a couple really good ones are IQ Air. I have the Austin Air HealthMate Plus. That's my favorite. I have both. They come in colors. So that was kind of a cool thing. And it actually filters the VOCs. So I can literally tell. What I do is at night in my office, I turn it on high. I come in the morning, it's the most wonderful feeling, this fresh air, and I have it low all day long. And I've had patients super sensitive like me come in and say, oh, this feels so good. Because they're like me, they can go into a building and say, I feel good or bad. So I always have patients who have susceptibility get one in their bedroom for sure. Mine will filter 1,500 square feet. So in my condo, I just have one and it does a whole house. Get fresh air, walk on the earth, so those basic things, and make sure you're exchanging air. So as long as it's not, ice cold winter, open your windows, open your doors, get that air circulation. So those are the keys. Get out of the situation, get an air filter, and get testing, get remediation. Second, you have to look at belongings and things that might be making you sick. For me, this is fascinating. I refused for about 2 months to give up my paper charts, and they were toxic for my old office, and I was getting sick. And actually saw markers on my blood that this C4A, which we didn't even talk about, but that's usually an acute exposure. For me, that was the marker that as soon as I got rid of those paper charts. So I was out of the office and I'd taken my paper charts with me, and every day I would go through and I try to minimize the exposure. My staff would help me, but I still would get red eyes and then the immune dysfunction, and that went on until I got rid of, we scanned all those charts and kind of started fresh. But how crazy is that? And same with my books. Yeah, so you have to get rid of paper products, or for me, I love my books. They're all stored in my garage right now. I'm hoping someday maybe I can go back to them, but it is what it is, and I've kind of as a loss, no big deal. So you have to make sure, and clothing most of the time can be washed, but there are some things that are porous. What you can do if it's like a memory, like photos that you can't replace, you can either have them scanned by services, or you can store them for 5-10 years or however long you think until you're not sensitive.
Let's pause right there on the books, because this is really important. So your office was water damaged, but your books were just on a shelf somewhere. And I'm guessing they didn't have signs of visible mold, but just because they were in the same vicinity of the toxic mold, they have residues that could potentially make you sick. Is that what we're talking about?
That is exactly right. So these were far, far, far away, 2 stories away from the mold. It's just the air that has these mycotoxins of VOCs and spores and all of that, and fragments of fungus. And the thing about, I didn't even talk about this, but we're talking about mold, but in a water damaged building, it's so much bigger than that, because there's bacteria, there's fungi, there's mycotoxins, there's a bunch of things, and these all disrupt the immune system in someone who's susceptible. So it's not just the mold, it's this bigger picture of water damage and what it does. But yeah, get rid of the books, sadly.
That's a tough one.
Yeah.
People. Oh my goodness. So sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I think we were going to finish off on some nutrition.
2 minutes. Yeah. So binders are huge. And that has definitely been one of the hugest things in helping me heal. So the 2 things I always start with, glutathione. We didn't even talk about this, but your glutathione system is trashed. Glutathione basically helps you respond to a toxin. So if you're in a moldy environment or water damaged building, your glutathione tanks. So you have to restore that, and you can do that through precursors like vitamin C. For a long time, I took like 10 grams of vitamin C a day. You can do IVs if you tolerate them. You can do IV glutathione or oral glutathione, and those are all really helpful to restore. You can do N-acetylcysteine or alpha-lipoic acid, and I've done almost all the above. The second thing is binders. So Dr. Shoemaker's really studied cholestyramine, and it's extremely effective. It's inconvenient, and it has to be taken 4 times a day, and it has side effects of heartburn, gas, bloating, constipation. His research is really geared around that drug, and it's very effective, and it's shown to decrease the visual contrast study dysfunction. So that's actually another test you can do, VCS testing, and that will show if you have inability to perceive the changes in dark and light between lines. That's a real early test. If you want to know if you might have issues, you can go online and do that. And I think the first test is free, so that might clue you in on it if you need to go some further testing and look. But that has been shown to increase that that score on that test. I'll tell you personally, I have not used cholestyramine, and I've very successfully used clay and charcoal. So and again, I put some specific products I like on my website, but those have been super effective for me. Interesting, people have to be prepared. I think I mentioned the hives in my body. When I first started detoxing, all of a sudden when you bind this toxin, you actually get re-exposed to them. And so when I first, that probably whole 2 months when I started detoxing, I got a little bit sicker before I got better, because I was actually trying to mobilize those toxins, and it caused hives, it caused incredible fatigue and brain fog. So people have to be prepared and go at the speed their body can handle. So glutathione and binders are kind of the first 2 things you can't miss.
Yeah, tons of great information, and we're going to take show notes and have that all at highintensityhealth.com. I'll have a link to your website, Dr. Jill, and also your previous interview, episode number 33, which was equally exciting, but it was more focused on the gut and Candida and SIBO. So before we part ways, I want to pick your brain on your morning routine, because I know you had something fun to share about that.
Sure. So I am totally a morning person. My normal waking time is 5 a.m. Once in a while, I get up at 4:30 or 4:45. And I love that time as far as just quiet. I get so much done in that first hour or 2. Typically what I do is I get up, my coffee grinder's set to go off with bulletproof coffee, right? Thank you, Dave. Right at 5 a.m. So I get up, and interesting, now my routine involves charcoal first, because you have to take binders away from everything else. And because of my antidiuretic hormone dysfunction, I actually drink a large glass of electrolytes with salt water and my charcoal first. And then shortly after that, I'll have a cup of coffee with MCT oil. And I don't do the butter because I'm a little sensitive to dairy, even butter. But I do lots of MCT, brain octane, or something similar. And then I sit down to my computer and I kind of just scan as far as emails that have come in, what my agenda is going to be for the day. And interestingly, if you follow me at all on social media, I love to post research, and I'm always reading that. So my morning first hour from 5 to 6 or 6:30 is scanning the research. What's the latest out on the microbiome? I know we love that. What's the latest on LPS, lipopolysaccharide, and what's the latest on mold and mold toxicity and mycotoxins? And I have all kinds of really cool Google alerts. So I get all in my inbox the best of the research, and then I kind of scan through. And what I usually do is I'll read those. If it's something I'm like, oh, someone might be interested in this, I will publish it on my social media, LinkedIn and Twitter and all those things to share. And people might find that interesting, or maybe not, if they're not a geek like me. So that first hour is just kind of scanning the data, scanning the day, and then answering any patient things that came in overnight. And then about 6:15, I will either go for a run or do some free weights or do some sort of exercise, and jump in the shower at 7, and I leave for work at 8. So that's kind of the morning.
Very productive. Yeah, there's a great book, The Morning Miracle by Hal Elrod. Have you
I haven't, but I want to. It's on my to-do.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. It was one of those things that I wanted to read for a long time, and I would do a lot of my research and writing at night, and I was up to like 12:30 or 1. Since reading that, I'm just like you, up early, looking through the literature and reaching out to people like yourself that I need to do a podcast with or whatever. And it's so much more productive. And getting that productivity started in the early part of the day really launches your day off to a successful day, I feel. Thanks again, Dr. Joe, for coming on the show. And I know our listeners are going to want to connect with you on social media, so I'm going to post all those links. But your website is just Dr. Joe Carnahan, is that right?
Yeah, my old it goes to the same, but just Jill Carnahan, CARNAHAN.com.
Perfect. And I will encourage folks to go there, check out your blogs. You're very active on social media, Twitter and LinkedIn. And some of the posts that you post get shared like hundreds, if not thousands of times. So people are digging the work that you do. So keep up the great work. And thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me, Mike. Love your podcast. I hope everyone continues to listen, and go to the place, was it on iTunes, where you can rate it? Go give Mike some good ratings. This is awesome. You bring great data, Mike. I listen to your podcast. Everyone else should as well. And thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for that.
You're welcome.